When Paul says a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, does that mean that Paul disagrees with the grounds of divorce that Jesus affirmed and that God said in both Deuteronomy and Exodus?
You have to see where Paul is saying that. Paul's saying that at the end of 1 Corinthians 7. He's been going through talking to people who aren't married, people who are married, people who are worrying about their betrothal, whether to go through with it. Then at the end of the chapter, he comes to talking to widows. And the widows are in a very special situation, especially in the Jewish world, because they're worried whether they're going to be made to marry their brother-in-law. If a widow in Jewish society hasn't had a male child, then they have to marry their brother-in-law to have that male child. Here Paul says, a wife is bound as long as her husband is living, but when her husband dies, she is free, and she's free to marry anyone she wishes. So she doesn't have to marry that brother-in-law. You get a very similar thing in Romans, so with very similar words. And you might conclude from that, well, you can only remarry if your ex-husband has died. And that's a very common interpretation. Because this here is talking to widows, and you wouldn't expect Paul to be talking to a widow who's been divorced. A widow is always broken from a marriage by death. We found a divorce certificate on top of Masada. That's the outpost on the mountain where they held out against the Romans. And there, at the end of their divorce certificate, it says very clearly, you are now free to marry any Jewish man you wish. Those are the exact same words which are quoted by Paul. And he says, if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, but only in the Lord. See here, instead of adding Jewish. Only a Jew, he says only a Christian. So he's agreeing with divorce. Because he says, well, surely, if a divorcee has these rights to marry whoever she wishes, a widow certainly has these rights, and she can marry whoever she wishes, but in the Lord.